working with us. And I'd like to say we're the most rambunctious group. And so I'm looking forward to you helping to rein us in, but I really appreciate you working with us today, and looking forward to diving right in. So with that, we can, Ginger, if you don't mind sharing your screen, we could start with the presentation, and I'll read off the lovely preamble that we read every time. So the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So with that, I'll just give a quick overview of what we'll discuss today. And my apologies in advance if there's a little bit of noise in the background. I'm in between meetings and somehow had the great idea of taking this from a coffee shop. So you will be hearing some background noise when I'm talking, but when I'm not, I'll be muted. So in terms of the agenda, again, welcome. The meeting is called to order. I just read the statement. Everyone, at least on my screen, is listed to the right from an attendance standpoint, so we don't need to do roll call. Do want to give just a special thanks to Dr. Nava McKinney for leading the meeting in my stead when I was absent. During the last meeting, I was out of the country and totally in a time zone that would have made me I would not have made any sense at the time of day it would have been for me to lead the meeting. So I appreciate you, Dr. Nava McKinney, and looking forward to diving back in. Also wanted to just point out from maybe it's not a housekeeping standpoint, but just from a point of order, I just recall when my parents, they were educators before moving into different respective industries. And when I was in school, they weren't educators at the time, but they, as parents, really made sure their voices were heard. And because their voices were heard, it allowed me, it allowed my brother, and those around us to really be able to advocate for ourselves. And we knew that we had folks who advocated for us. And given that this subcommittee is a parent subcommittee and it's about parent voice, just want to make sure that our parents that are on the call that might not consider themselves educators or might not be formal educators, but are parents in every right, I want to make sure that their voices are being heard. And so if you haven't spoken up, or if you want to reach out to any of us, myself or Ginger offline, and for us to share comments on your behalf, we're happy to do so. But definitely want you to know that we want your voice to be heard and want to give space for that. So I just wanted to name that. It was really powerful for my brother and I growing up, or for my brother and me growing up, to have that parent voice. And given the interest of this committee and what we want to do for the students of our great state, I want to make sure that that works for our students as well, and the parents' voices are heard. So with that, I think we can look back, or really look at the draft funding formula that's been put out, and spend some time just reviewing that if you haven't already, and would like to look at that and see what we would want to add to that based on what we've done or created so far, unless there are any questions. All right, Ginger, maybe we can pull that up. So let's spend maybe 30 seconds, maybe just give it a minute. For those of you who haven't looked at it, hopefully you have, and want to make sure that we're all familiar with what has been put out as a draft. I just want to underscore it's a draft framework for public review and comment. And based on what we see here and based on what we've been discussing over the last several weeks, we want to see if there's anything that we'd want to add to that, if we feel as if there's something that hasn't been mentioned that is really important to us to call out.
I'll also share this is in your Google Drive folder as well. If you want to pull your own copy up and scroll at your own pace, please feel free to do so.
Derwin, not trying to put anybody on the spot or anything, but for those who are our parents or who are representing parent groups, would certainly just love to encourage them to speak up. And I'm not sure that I know who they are in our committee. But again, not trying to put anyone on the spot, but.
I appreciate that, Blair. Echoing what you said, and consider this not putting anyone on the spot, but really wanting to help lift up the voices of parents, not just on this call, but across our state. And really, it's truly important for us to make sure that is not just a consideration, but the priority for this subcommittee.
Also, I'm trying to pull this up and I can't find it. Sorry, I'm trying to pull this up in our folder. What's it called in our folder? In our Google Docs folder.
It is called, actually, I think it's, go for it, Ginger, sorry.
No, go ahead if you have it pulled up.
Well, based on, I do have it pulled up. It is Draft Formula Overview, January 11th, 2021. At least that's what it's saved at as my PDF. And Google has been a little wonky with me over the last couple of days, where I go to the drive and I know it's there and it disappears, and then I refresh and it pops back up. So that might be happening too.
Good morning, Derwin. I have a clarifying question. I saw a PowerPoint from the steering committee that specifically said that this is not a formula, rather it's a framework. So should we be referring to it as a framework versus a formula, or does that matter?
I can.
Sorry, I was in between screens and trying to unmute. So go for it, Ginger, sorry.
Yeah, I think to your point, this is the framework that will ultimately lead us to a formula. So at this point, as you guys know, there are no dollar amounts associated with this. We're still working through those pieces as well as what specifically those weights will be. So this is sort of the formula framework, if you will. So I think it's not a formula yet. It is kind of the pre-work to get us there.
Thank you.
So with that, as we look at this draft, would love to just get some initial reactions before we compare it to what we want to include or what we've suggested or recommended be included. Would love to get reactions from those of us on the subcommittee about what we see so far. Generally, are we heading in the right direction? Do we feel like this mirrors what we've been saying? Is there anything else that we should be considering? Just love to get some reactions about this.
So if you don't mind, I'll start off that conversation. This is Dr. Berthina, Nabaa McKinney, and hope everyone is well and had a great MLK weekend. I do want to echo some of the concerns that came out of parents here in Nashville, Davidson County around the funding framework. And one of the concerns was if this initiative in and of itself was a a way to outsource money away from our public schools into the private arena. I know that there was that was asked at our local town hall that was hosted in Davidson County, and there was a lot of concern about a push for ESA or the vouchers. It was ironic that the funding framework or formula came out, was publicized at the same time that there was a legislation or a bill that's going through our Tennessee legislature around ESA vouchers. So I know that there has been some transparency from the governor to say that this is not the case, but I do want to kind of bring that to light if we're voicing parents' concerns and initial reactions that came out of looking at this and looking at that legislation.
Thank you for sharing that. I agree that this, at least in terms of what I've been hearing there, this isn't related to ESA or vouchers at all. This is actually the first that I'm hearing of it. So I'm glad that you're sharing the concerns from the parents that you engage with. I think one thing that also stands out as you speak to that is that, again, while this is a draft, I'm just echoing that this is a draft, underscoring that this is a draft, what isn't happening, or the intention is not for money to be sifted out from the, how we currently fund students and redirected someplace else. That at minimum, funding will stay, the amount of funding will stay the same, or at minimum, the amount of funding will stay the same. The goal is to build on what we currently have, not to take away from what we currently have and to redistribute to a voucher program or what have you. That is my understanding. But just given some of the concerns that you just shared, I think it's important to note that the goal for this subcommittee or the subcommittees is to come up with something that is additive, not something that takes away from the current students that we support today.
Thank you. The other question that we have, and hopefully you guys can answer it, is would you please explain, we understand that when we're looking at the weights for poverty, rural, unique learning needs that we're looking at, there's also an added charter weight that was not for charter schools that was not there previously. Would you explain what that is and what impact it has on the weights?
Yes, and Ginger, would you mind scrolling to that? Oh, actually, it's right there. Sorry, I was looking for the weights, but it's there. So my understanding, I'm just speaking as one individual interpreting this, it is to ensure that and this is particularly for charter schools that utilize district facilities. I was once a charter operator utilizing a district facility, and it's really challenging, particularly when you're in older facilities that have deferred maintenance, that have other issues that come along, costs that are associated with the building that aren't considered when you're looking at funding a school program. And so this essentially addresses that to some degree. As you can see from a weight standpoint, it's pretty light. I personally would like to see, for anyone or any district or operator that is working with a facility that has deferred maintenance or any kind of issues related to that, would like to see more funding directed in that way. Because if it's not, then what happens is funding gets directed to fix a leaky roof, for lack of a better example, instead of addressing more of the in-classroom supports. And it becomes you really start stretching thin around the operations and facilities and moving away from what matters the most, which is what's going on inside the classroom. And so this, I believe, is to address that, which is why it speaks to the rent and maintenance, and particularly for facilities that are owned by local school districts that essentially want the charter operators to manage the facility all by themselves. And that's what that speaks to.
Jerwin, could I just briefly speak to that issue as well?
Sure.
From a similar background. Yeah, I mean, I think just so most folks understand, right? Like in Tennessee, most of the operating costs, teachers and all the programmatic support comes through the BEP model with both the state and local contribution, but most facility costs are borne by the local government, right? And so every year, Shelby County government, for instance, Metro Nashville does, tens of millions of dollars of bonds that go to the construction and capital maintenance of public school facilities. Charter schools are not, in most cases, included in those models. And so any facility cost, whether it's rent to a district or a payment on a loan that's privately financed, are coming out of the operating dollars. And so it's not really a level playing field. And so I think the wording here could be tweaked. Derwin, that would be my feedback. I mean, I think really any situation in which a charter school is taking operating dollars, whether it's owned by the district or a private entity, I would think that would need to be adjusted, in my personal opinion, to ensure that kids in public charter schools have equitable funding for their services. So that's the only real change that I think I would have to the document. But just while I have the shell, I'll say I was thrilled on the whole with this document. I thought the poverty and the concentration of poverty and special needs, which are the 2 or 3 main themes I've been concerned with and that I think our parents are most directly impacted by, are clearly identified here as high priorities, which I think is awesome. And I'd be curious, some more details on the weighting of the special ed and English language learner piece and how that will look, even if it's not a dollar figure, how it would be proportionally. Let's say, we talked at the last meeting about some other states and the relative weight as a proportion they give in those areas. So I'd be eager to see that. But in terms of a direction, I think overall it was great. I think the charter piece, while it should be adjusted, is appropriate for that to be a light weight. Relative to the others. But that's my initial feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And are there any, would love to, some of the, I think there was some other areas that I thought I was glad to see addressed, particularly around the rural areas. And Blair, I see you raising your hand. And actually, I'm thinking of you as I'm saying this, when we get to early childhood and just, it seems to be language moving in that direction. Would love to get your thoughts and others on the call around, is that good enough? What else could we be adding as we speak to just the early childhood or the pre-K for funding?
Yeah, I think I'll make 3-ish comments here briefly. The first is just from a conversation we had last time, and apologies to the gentleman who raised this, but I know he was representing parent voice and made a number of comments in the chat last time. And so with him in mind and his comments in mind, and also frankly what we heard, we held a virtual town hall, Tennesseans for Quality Early Education did last week, Commissioner Schwinn, and we had breakout sessions. We had 120 people attending and great input, specifically focused on early learning. But the first thing I want to reiterate is just this sort of parent engagement and the importance, just echoing the comments of the gentleman last week, the importance of parent engagement and the sort of tools and resources and personnel sufficient to support that, and the acknowledgement that it does, it does require some coordination at the school level. And so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but from our virtual town hall, one of the things we heard is greater, engagement, sort of parent engagement coordinators, just with an eye towards parent and family engagement, whatever that looks like, but the acknowledgement that some sort of personnel needs to be intentionally focused on that and providing tools and supports to parents, what they can do at home and how they can be more engaged. And creating avenues and vehicles to do that. So that was just one thing I wanted to mention, kind of back to what I've spent a lot of time talking about in these sessions.
Sorry, Blair, just before you get away from that first point, do you think that particularly the area that speaks to overall salaries outside of educators, I'm just quoting the piece around this, but there's been some comment related to salary schedules for non-educators. Does that speak to what you've just described, or would you want something more than that?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to whether or not every school has a parent engagement coordinator if that is a staff position funded. I'm not sure if it is. I'm not aware that it is part of the BEP, but if someone, I stand ready to learn if that's something. But I guess I'm just trying to echo the comment about sufficient staffing, whatever that looks like. And if the person who, and I apologize, I don't know the gentleman's name who was speaking last week, but we heard parent engagement coordinators is a term that we heard at our town hall meeting.
Excuse me.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I know you have I know you have a couple more points, Blair, but before we jump in, I see that Ashlyn Sparks is raising her hand, and I'm imagining, just given she's with
Sure. I'll pause.
Left, that she'll be able to speak to that, and then we can get to the other 2 points.
Yeah, great.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashlyn Sparks. I'm representing the Memphis Lift for Miss Sarah Carpenter. Just having some health issues right now. One thing that has been really big in our work these past probably 1.5 to 2 years is not only transparency in data, but how the data is communicated for parents in terms of accessibility. Just thinking about parent-friendly language in communication of data. I think in education, a lot of the times we get really lost in jargon and words that we get really comfortable using and phrases, but parents oftentimes are confused by them, and it can deter them from engaging in the process. So that's one thing that has been really big for us, is making sure that as the state, or even as Shelby County is trying to have all this new data and these new reports coming out, that they are meant for parents to be able to read, understand, and walk away knowing exactly what's going on. Because in the end, if that's not the case, then why are we reporting the data at all? So just in the language around transparency, accountability, and reporting in that section, just making sure that it's really clear that as we're communicating this data, it's done in a way that's parent friendly.
I appreciate you lifting that up. I wholly agree with you that it's not in our best interest to create even a formula that's so, we don't need a multiple regression analysis to lay out, to show that we are quote unquote doing the work. I think if we can show something that really speaks to all people, particularly our parents and even our students, quite frankly, in terms of accountability and outcomes, I think that will be in everyone's best interest. So I appreciate you lifting that up. Okay, Blair, sorry to stick with that one point, but
yeah, I was trying to
continue.
lift out that point, and if anybody wanted to comment on it, but back to I was also really overall very, very pleased with the framework, and I think they did a really nice job at the things that I know we want to see, and again that were reiterated in our town hall that we had last week, and in our voter survey, as you all have heard me say this, is that the items that are listed as additional, I think we'd rather see them more squarely in the middle in the framework rather than additional funding. And those are additional, it says additional considerations supported by subcommittee. The pre-K to third grade band, we talked about that last week. I think it was Bob who mentioned, maybe a focus on an age band. And we love the verbiage that's in there. We think that's really well articulated. It speaks to particularly to some of the things that we know work, including that high dosage tutoring, which is mentioned. The high dosage tutoring is mentioned in if you go up there to the base, no, where is it? It's in, not the weights, in the direct funding. It's right under fast growing, says tutoring there for rising fourth grade students who scored at below. But we think that this sort of one-on-one tutoring, or 1-on-3, the high dosage low ratio tutoring needs to be for children K through third, basically through rising fourth, not just for rising fourth graders, because that's too late, especially when we have just implemented a third grade retention law. And so the tutoring needs to be made available to children who are below, using some defined assessment, perhaps the literacy screener or other tool that has been put in place, but it needs to be made available to the younger grades all the way through. And then the other piece, but I liked the full language there and the additional considerations under pre-K to third grade and university pre-K. And I say, I liked it, but I liked it on behalf of Tennesseans for Quality Early Education and thinks it reflects what we know that the data tells us about the importance of the early grades and return on investment there, and what our parents, and the people, voters across Tennessee want.
And Blair, to that point, and again, would love to hear from some of our parents. What I noticed too, in terms of outcomes, the outcomes were certainly more geared towards high school outcomes rather than your early education, your elementary, even middle. I think one
Great
outcome
point.
was related
Thank
to
you. I noticed that too.
Seventh and eighth grade. And so, how do we, especially if there's going to be a bonus for outcomes, then, what do we do for elementary schools? What do we do for middle schools? Are all the bonuses just being directed to high schools? And then what does that mean for a district that might be, might have outside elementary, middle schools more so than their high school? What does that mean for other
Great
operators
point.
that typically it's, five elementaries to 3 middles to 1 high school, what have you, then it's totally out of whack. And so would love to see us directing more of that outcomes, piece to early education.
That third grade critical benchmark. Amen. And sorry, I had one other thing just to clarify. I was thrilled to see in the base counselors and school-based supports. I do just want to clarify that counselors, I know there are a lot of different types of counselors, and I just want to emphasize that the data is showing just a growing crisis in mental health. And I just want to clarify, like, mental health, licensed mental health clinicians is what I would mean by a counselor. And what we've heard, regularly and repeatedly. And I think that that's popped up a lot in the virtual town, in all the town halls that have been held across the board in the public comment. Mental health counselors versus a guidance counselor who helps with academic, guidance and guidance into college and that kind of thing, which is also important. But
I appreciate that and agree with you on that. The specificity piece, and that's some of what's been talked about too with Commissioner Swin and others around this is the draft, right? And we are working to get more specific in areas like that. And so that is one great example of how we can be more specific around what we mean by counselors and how we direct funding in that direction. I see Dwight Hunter has his hand raised. Would love to make sure he's heard.
Hey, Jerwin.
Dwight, if you're speaking, you're muted. Okay, there you go.
Hey, just trying to get my hand lowered back down. I
can take care of that. Don't worry.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I just want to thank Blair for her comments there about the parent engagement and family engagement. Something I was speaking towards about in the last meeting quite a bit, because I think is important. When you read all the information from the U.S. government, there's a lot of family and community engagement factors involved. In fact, I don't know how many of y'all know, but schools in school districts in Tennessee are graded on family engagement levels. So I think it's important to have that additional information in the framework here. Now every school district has a family and community engagement director. I know there's one here in Hampton County, but I don't know if all school districts have that. So I think it's important that that's included, because the Tennessee has quite a few laws been passed about parent involvement, and including the standards for family and school engagement. So I think it's kind of important to make sure that's included somewhere. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, and again, wanting to make sure all of our voices are being heard. For those of you who haven't spoken, would love to get your reactions to this. And Blair, I'm not sure if you had any additional points to add. just want to make sure that that wasn't lost either.
I appreciate that. I'll would love to let others be heard.
I'll jump in really quickly. I am a parent representative on this board, and I've been speaking to a lot of parents since this was released, and a lot of them, it comes down to the specificity that we were just talking about during the, they have questions more than anything right now about what things mean. When we talk about counselors, coming back to that, what does that specifically mean? Are we talking about funding them at standards, at national standards for where we should be, which we are grossly underfunded? Where the specificity needs to be there, and coming back again to something that's already been mentioned, in language that parents understand. Because there's a lot of questions here. I think the framework, overall positive reaction from myself, from every parent I've talked to. This is what we've been talking about for the most part. This is where we need to be headed. I haven't heard really very specific concerns from parents and very specific things they would like to be changed. But overall positive direction and seeing where we're going, it's great steps forward for Tennessee. A couple of things, and I saw this in the in the comments as well. The public comments, I don't know if everybody's gotten a chance to read through a lot of the ones that were just uploaded, but a concern that I've heard, and that over and over again, in the weighted funding for students with qualifying 504s for dyslexia, that language needs some change there. Additional weighting for dyslexia as a whole before the qualification for the dyslexia, the 504 qualification comes in, because we need supports before. If you guys have never gone through actually getting a student qualified, I have a student who has a 504 myself. It's a process and it takes time. So changing that so that it's, I believe the language that was requested was additional weighting for characteristics of dyslexia versus a qualifying plan, a qualifying 504 for dyslexia, so that we're supporting that before you actually get through the process, right? We're supporting them before. Sometimes it can take 9 months to get a 504 and IEP in place. So just some language things there, some specificity, and to answer a question that was asked earlier, most schools do not have a parent engagement person that is funded. That, and definitely not funded publicly. If there's funding for a 504, it comes from one of two places generally, specifically federal funding. As a Title I school, those schools would have a parent engagement person as part of their federal funding. But otherwise, it's generally through partnerships. I know here in Hamilton County, almost all of our parent engagement personnel are through partnerships and funded from outside sources. So very few schools have someone who is funded through their general funding that would come out of their general budget. So that's something that I think maybe we need some, if that's a consideration, that would have to be a language thing. I think districts don't tend to use that funding for that purpose. And that's really what I've got. Just a lot of questions about, and I agree with there were a lot of questions about the funding for charters as I've talked to parents. So I think clarifying that language there would help answer parent questions about the funding, being specifically for the buildings versus other things, or to help those concerns, I should say. So just some language clarification things that I've heard from parents.
Thank you, Christy. Really, really helpful. And we'll make sure that all of that is noted so that we can address that. Yeah, and I think even particularly around, and I just know this as a former charter operator, and I wondered about this myself when I saw it, just seeing charter schools in a document for public schools across the state, recognizing that charter schools are also public schools. Charter just becomes such a loaded word that it then all sorts of questions start to be raised around, equity questions, just because of how loaded it is, even though I believe, even in this case, it's really just to make sure that there's a level playing field, no matter the school type. To see charter is just like to see rural, or to see impoverished, or there's different words that spark whatever thoughts that we have. And for some reason, charter has is a loaded word and can draw a lot of, raise a lot of eyebrows. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. And it's just something for us to make sure that we have the right language in there so that we all know what we're signing up for, and agree that it's around equity.
Derwin, I think another concern that came up is in the outcomes section. where there was a concern around tying, I believe, tying outcomes to funding. And there was a concern around, would that penalize already struggling districts and schools with that outcome? I guess it's the language in which it is being displayed and all of that, but there's a really big concern about, will this continue to penalize already struggling districts and give more of an advantage to already affluent and prosperous districts?
Could I just add on the performance piece? I mean, we talked about this a little bit at the last meeting there when Dr. Naba-McKinney was facilitating for you. I think I see where they're going with this, and in a certain sense, like theoretically, I maybe appreciate where they're coming from. We have an accountability model. We have an extremely rigorous and stringent accountability model. And I think we need to distinguish the purposes of these models. The funding model doesn't need to be the accountability model. We have a way of holding schools accountable and a way of holding teachers accountable. To sort of add that into the funding model, I think muddies the purpose and potentially significantly distorts what we're doing with the testing framework. Particularly since they haven't named a test here, I'm imagining they're not planning to do it based on 10 ready, but most of these like the designers tell you, like the purpose of this test is diagnostic, for instance, right? And I think there needs to be much more research on the potential adverse incentives of tying dollars to some of these tests in a very highly direct way, and how we tease out how different, and I think Dr. Naba-McKinney was just referring to this, how different. We'd have to see a lot more information on how it was going to be growth-based or how it would be available to populations that were starting with higher needs, rather than sort of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. So it's not that I'm against the theory, it's that I think the practical implications of this are phenomenally complex, but that I really worry about introducing that and potentially offsetting some of the other gains from this, when the reality is, just to be blunt about it, there simply is not adequate funding right now to serve the most severe student needs. And so to say that the problem is the incentives rather than mere adequacy, and I know we're not here to comment on the previous model, but before we can talk about incentives, we have to talk about what is the ante that is required to equitably get children to the table. And when we're talking about children with severe disabilities, for instance, the current model pays less than 30 cents on the dollar of the actual cost of service. And so it's just not appropriate, I think, to discuss, incentive pay around that before we've provided adequacy.
Yes, I hear you. You both loudly and clearly. There's something to be said for not perpetuating the inequities that already exist by not allowing schools that are already behind to not get an opportunity to catch up, essentially, because they are behind and then are not getting the bonus points or the bonus incentives. So definitely appreciate you all naming that, and we need to make sure that that's on the record and giving this feedback. So maybe this is a good time. We only have about 20 minutes left. I'm not sure we'll get to the policy piece. We can definitely get to that during our next meeting. Would like for us to look at what we currently have on our list now that we've looked at the draft. I'd like to look at the list that we currently have, and for us to consider what else we might want to include, what might not be listed on here. And we can have a discussion on that, and just given we're short on time. So again, we've looked at the draft, we've responded to that. We also know that we have our own list that we shared to provide feedback and input into this draft. What do we have here? What's not listed, or what is listed that we think isn't getting its just debut in this draft that we can make sure we have listed?
Something I have heard regularly, and I know it to be an evidence-based practice, and is coaching, is actual coaches, sort of teacher coaches. What I know about, I heard it from partners and friends in Shelby County, that's something that they would like to see funding for in our schools. And I'm reflecting it here. I don't know what other people's comments or thoughts about that would be, but I've certainly heard that would really help strengthen teaching, professional development.
I agree, Blair, coaching as well as a more of an emphasis on professional development for teachers as well.
I'm going to try not to interject as much just so that we can get as many voices heard as possible. So please don't take the silence for a lack of engagement. Just want to make sure that we're all sharing out as many times as we feel necessary, those areas that need to be addressed that haven't been addressed.
We also, I'm trying to remember if we have it in here, and I'm not sure really where it goes exactly, but it's partly to do with sort of parent and family engagement coordinators that I mentioned earlier, but it's also about not just engagement, about family support coordinators. So the community in schools model or community schools model or Head Start model, where you actually have a staff dedicated to connecting families to resources, everything from sort of after school care to nutrition assistance and supports to sort of recognizing and being a resource to families, to particularly economically disadvantaged families.
As another prompter, are there any items here that we'd want to reconsider that after further thought we don't think should be prioritized?
One thought back to the prompt previously. So I know technology is typically thought of as like a one-time expense, but based off of experiences going from mostly virtual last year to now being back in person, it seems like a lot of schools have rolled back their technology efforts because things have broken. They don't have the money to replace them. Technologies change all the time. So while the initial purchase of technology might be a one-time issue, I think maintenance of technology is something that needs to be addressed every year. And I don't know if there's a place already set in this list for that, but that's something that has been really frustrating this year for our parents, is their kids had this one-to-one technology last year, and now a lot of places they're not able to do that because of they're just not able to replace the technology.
I think there's something on here that was a suggestion last time, and I just want to raise it, and I'm not totally sure it fits, but Bob, this might have been yours. I can't remember. It was in the context of, we were talking about pre-K to third grade. It's under weights, there's a bullet, the last bullet, that says grade span weights. And that it's sort of non-specific there. I think you could argue for pre-K to third grade. I mean, I could, to have an additional weighting given the importance. I think I would rather than say these grades are more important than these grades, and should be reflected in weights, I would rather be more kind of have the funding addressed, not in the weight for pre-K to third, but in specific direct funding for programs.
You know, grade span weighting is a very interesting, and I mean, I spent quite a bit of time looking through the EdBuild website at a bunch of other states, and it's, people are all over the map on this, and the problem is the tail wags the dog, because it's like, well, what does it cost to serve this grade level, or what does it cost to serve that grade level? Well, it depends on what you want to offer them. Sure, if you want tons of CTE and post-secondary and this, that, and the other thing on top of core academics in high school, then sure, high school costs a lot more. But if you don't define that as including that, then why is it necessarily more expensive? Conversely, lower elementary and early childhood, it's like, well, this is our best chance to, yeah, you don't need all those bells and whistles, so it could be cheaper. Conversely, do you really want to invest in the smaller class sizes that we think really are necessary? So, I mean, do I think there should be a stronger weight for early childhood? Yes. But I think it really like begs the question that needs to be answered about what we want to provide. And I am, like I've said, I don't want to repeat everything I've said in previous meetings. I think a lot of the ideas about enrichment and extension in middle school and high school are great. As a former middle school and high school educator, I can see all the arguments for that. But over the recent years, as I've been working in early childhood, it's just so clear to me that sort of the rest of that is never going to be addressed until we get this right. And that's why I'm working here now. And that's why I think we need to sort of say, realistically, we need to address the problem early on. So anyway, I just think it's hard to sort of have the debate about grade span weights until we say sort of more explicitly what are the objectives. And so I'm just, yeah, so like I said last time, like the technology thing. I mean, yes, everyone wants to wax rhapsodic about technology in the 21st century, but the number of sort of, you know, unused smart boards and outmoded computers sitting around the state is tragic and shocking. And we need to be much more judicious about addressing the core needs around curriculum and teacher preparation and teachers in the classroom and the class size ratio, and then we can deal with the technology piece rather than putting a lot of energy and emphasis there and not yet addressing the sort of fundamental needs of poverty and special education. So that's my piece. You got to make sure you can't have this without not having that. So I'm just being honest about, in the experience of our school, that sort of 2 or 3 things that I think need to be there before we add a bunch of other stuff from the wish list.
Yeah, so if there were grade span weights, you would be saying, yeah, let's make it for pre-K to third. Let's weight them more, give them the heavy moniker or tag, whatever it is that we have there. And then I would agree with that too. And then, but grade span, we really don't have enough information. Probably the better contribution we can make, rather than just say grade span weights, is what are the specifics that we're sort of expenditures that we need to make. And to me, I feel like that's pretty well captured in the other considerations section, but needs to be moved squarely into the meat and main part of the framework.
Yeah, the thing I would advocate for is the balance, so that, similar to the outcomes piece, that we're not top heavy on one side and forgetting about the other, whether it's we're all focused on early childhood and then we're forgetting about the later years, or we're focused on the later years and we're forgetting about the formative years. So I think what would stand out to me, or what I would like to see more of, is balance.
As a parent, I want to agree with that 100%. So up until last year, for the past 3 years, I have three children myself. I have had a child in elementary, middle, and high school. So I've been the grade span, right? I've been it all. My oldest is now a freshman in college, but I absolutely, there's got to be a balance there. When you are a parent and you actually see in action that we have such serious needs across all 3 grade bands. I mean, there are places that I could jump in right now and say, absolutely, we have got to put more funding down on our lower grade bands to get these kids pulled up. Absolutely. I have a child who's going to graduate next year. You have, so many months left with her, and if she's not prepared, that's it. We've lost our chance. So we do have to balance the needs of all the grades, and I think it's really important. And that's why the specificity has got to be there in this plan, as far as, just like you're saying, what is it that we're looking for? What do we want to do? I think, and that's what I'm hearing a lot of parents asking over and over again, well, what does this mean? Where are they going with this? And until we get that information, it's hard for us to, first of all, we can't answer it because we don't know when we're asked those questions, but it's hard to say where we need to throw the money, because it's got to be everywhere. Again, you're right that we have to pull these kids up, or they're never going to be successful later on if we don't get them early on. But then again, when I look at technology, I'll give you a real example of something that happened. Technology needs to be very we need to be judicious in how we're applying our technology funds. Smart boards are often outdated, but having those laptops there and the access to services that kids need. My oldest couldn't apply for some scholarships she wanted to apply for because a particular platform that a college had asked for was something she'd never used before. My middle schooler, who had been one-to-one longer and had access to a plethora of technology, whose teachers were, a lot of PD here, were really well versed in technology, actually sat down with my high school senior last year and helped her apply for scholarships because she'd had the technology longer and was well versed. So there's definitely technology needs, there's reoccurring costs. We've got to have that too. So I think we need to kind of look at what our goals are and make sure that we are meeting the needs of all kids. And I think that's really important that we do talk about that it needs to be across all grade bands. And we need to see though what it is we need in those grade bands so that then we can make sure we're meeting those specific needs.
We have just a little under 10 minutes left. Want to make sure that everyone's voice is being heard on this. Are there any other reactions? And really, really do appreciate for those of us who are parents that spoke and those of us who are representing parents. I think in many ways, some of us are both. I really appreciate just lifting up what we've been hearing from parents across the state around this. And this is feedback that we'll be able to contribute to updating this draft, hopefully.
I think I want to also just acknowledge and agree with the concerns that Bob raised about outcomes funding. That I similarly agree with it directionally and in kind of philosophically at some level, but I agree that he raised some great points about how it could conflict with and confuse our existing accountability system and perhaps even work, against our existing accountability system, which is really strong and really good.
Well, I'll take the silence as there are no other comments around this. We have about, say, 5 minutes left. I don't want us to rush into the policy piece, but maybe, Ginger, if you don't mind pulling up just the presentation for today, we can scroll all the way to the end and maybe just talk through what we want to talk about around policy discussion. And actually, you might not even need to pull it up just because it wouldn't make sense for us, I think, to dive in right now. But as we think about, this is probably a good slide to keep up. As we think about the policies that are related to how we address funding moving forward, would want us to come with that, in our arsenal next time we meet so that we could dive right into the policy piece. Let's imagine, or let's just consider these, our reactions, our comments as it relates to the funding formula to date. Just consider that piece closed on our part. And now let's, shift our minds into policy thinking. And so for our next meeting, if we could come prepared to talk about just, what policy considerations we should think about as it relates to, we have the examples here. How do we define student groups? What policies could we recommend around funding? Some of it we've talked about early childhood, for instance. We've talked about facilities. We talked about technology. What things could we consider around policy to make sure that we not only come up with the right funding formula, but we also implement it in a way that is actionable and accountable by way of policy. So just something to keep in mind for our next meeting.
Derwin, can I briefly just recap some of the notes that I have so I can make sure I'm representing what the group has shared today, and you all can chime in if there's something that I've missed.
Yes, please.
Excellent. Okay, so it sounds like for the group, you all would advocate for adjusting what you had shared last time around the grade span weights, and actually bringing forward that pre-K third grade that's listed under other considerations. So bringing that forward as it's stated on the document and replacing your grade span weights, but still keeping it listed under weights as a formal recommendation from you guys. There was also a lot of conversation, and it sounded like as a whole, the group was in agreement on including under direct funding the parent family engagement coordinator, which is a little more specificity than how it was stated during the last meeting. So I think maybe making some clarification on that one. You all had engagement, student engagement, and all of that listed on during the last call, but this time making it a little more specific around parent and family engagement coordinator. And overall, though this is a funding formula versus, or a funding plan versus a spending plan, there needs to be some additional specificity that will help stakeholders really understand what some of these components are, specifically around like charter schools, counselors, and school-based supports. And when you all are speaking specifically about counselors, you're speaking about that through the lens of mental health clinicians. Do I have all of that stated correctly so far? Okay. And there was some discussion about potentially adding coaches, professional development, and then potentially technology as part of this funding framework. But I couldn't get a sense of, are we all in agreement on that, or is that just some, various opinions among the group?
I mean, in fairness, I think we would have to say that there's a range of opinions on the technology piece, and maybe we would need to better understand what is meant by what is specified in the proposal. And I would also, if I could just slightly elaborate the notes, I think the special education component is also great, but also in order to give more substantive feedback, I think we need a little bit more clarity about not the dollar figures, but the proportional weighting or types of needs, something like that.
Okay, universal pre-K to direct funding. Okay. I had that one on my list to ask about, and I wasn't sure which category you all had that one listed as. So, okay. And I think that one was also on the list from last time as well. So moving that one up to direct funding. Okay. And then the coaches and the professional development piece, is that leave this in the conversation as part of the base or somewhere else, or is that one kind of off the table for the group?
Well, I put it on, I guess. I raised it, so I'll vote for putting it in there. I think somebody, Dr. Nava McKinney, I think is who it was, also was sort of corroborating greater, kind of maybe systematic and systemic investment in professional development, and the coaching is certainly a well-known and strong evidence-based practice. So.
Yeah, I'd advocate for leaving it on as well. No one's requested that we pull it down, and so I think we should leave it on there.
Okay, I will leave that, add that to your all's list under the base. And those are all of the pieces that I have. If I'm missing something, please let me know.
Okay, and then we all have each other's email, so we can certainly feel free to reach out. If something is missing, feel free to reach out to me or to Dominique, and we can make sure that we're coordinating with Ginger. So we're now at that time. Just want to share that our next meeting is next Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel. Looking forward to seeing you all there, and really, really appreciate you all. Excited about how far we've come and where we're going, and can't wait to see where this all ends. And so enjoy the rest of your week. Ginger, thank you so much. We'll be in touch around next steps. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.